Our panel this afternoon will examine some possible solutions to the twin crises afflicting public higher education: tuition hyperinflation and its resulting student loan debt. As regards tuition hyperinflation, over the last 25 years, tuitions nationwide have increased 440%, which is nearly 4 times faster than general inflation, almost twice as fast as health care costs over the same period. To try to pay for these historic price increases, students and their parents have taken on an historic level of student loan debt. Today, student loan debt stands at $1.1 trillion. For the first time in history, student loan debt is greater even than total national credit card debt. The public gets it. If you look at the national surveys over the course of the last several years, for example, the national survey that the Pew Research Center did in 2012, the results are alarming. It found that 57% of prospective students believe that a college degree today is not worth what it costs. 75% in the same survey believe that a college degree today is simply unaffordable. Sallie Mae did a survey 2 years ago also, and it found that for the last 2 years, more families are making their decisions about college based on expenses. Well, there are 2 possible remedies to these crises that we'll be discussing this afternoon. The first is the Affordable Baccalaureate Degree Program, ushered in this past spring at Texas A&M Commerce, working with South Texas College and with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. I think it's right to say that the degree that they initiated last spring constitutes the first real $10,000 degree program. The question we'll address is, can such degrees be expanded? And I should remind everyone that the genesis of the Affordable Baccalaureate degree was Governor Rick Perry's 2011 State of the State address, where he called on universities to produce what he called then $10,000 degrees. But one thing that gets missed is he only asked that 10% of degrees awarded satisfy that price point, because, as we all know, there are some degrees that can't be done for that. Question is, how viable is the Affordable Baccalaureate degree with regard to extending to 10% of college degrees awarded by Texas public higher education institutions? And then second, we'll also discuss efforts to reduce administrative budgets. Many of you may be familiar with the 2011 study by Benjamin Ginsberg at Johns Hopkins. The title of his book is The Fall of the Faculty: The Rise of the All-Administrative University and Why It Matters. A spin-off piece that more of you may be familiar with that appeared in the Atlantic Monthly was called Administrators Ate My Tuition. What Ginsberg found, having worked as a professor and as a university administrator over the last 30 years, I wasn't surprised entirely, but I was still somewhat shocked by what he found. He found that over the past 4 decades, the number of professors has increased slightly more than 50% across the country. But during that same period, the number of administrators increased 85%, and the number of administrative staffers increased 240%. In fact, adjusting for inflation, from 1947 to 1995, overall university spending increased 148%, but administrative spending increased by 235% during that same period. Instructional spending, meaning teaching and learning, in contrast, increased only 128%, 20 points less than the overall rate of the spending increase. Accounting for some of this, and there are many factors that explain this, one of the things that Ginsberg points to is the fact that senior administrators at universities have done particularly well in the recent past. From 1998 to 2003, deans and vice presidents saw their salaries increase as much as 50%. By 2007, the salary paid to a president of a doctoral granting institution was $325,000. 81 presidents earned more than $500,000, and 12 earned over $1 million. To discuss these issues, we're fortunate to have three esteemed panelists with us this afternoon. To my immediate left is Senator Brian Birdwell. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, sir.
To his left, Commissioner Raymund Paredes, Commissioner of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, to his left, Professor Richard Vedder, Professor of Economics and a writer on higher education nearly everywhere and always. We'll begin with Senator Birdwell.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. The rules of engagement are always pretty simple. Be good, be brief, be gone. We were given 10 minutes. I'll only take a moment. I very much appreciate the invitation and opportunity to join you on this. This subject is one of the areas where government has a proper role and responsibility and function because of our state universities being a function of state government. But it is imperative that we begin treating higher education as a commodity as any other thing, bringing as much market-based reforms as we can so that students, parents/guardians can make the best decisions on the economic value of a degree that they pursue, regardless of what university here in Texas it is, based upon the value of that degree, their interests, and the like. Bring as many market-based decision criteria to the family, the taxpayer, the citizen of the state of Texas, knowing what they're going to get in return for that education or that tuition dollar and the value of that degree as they go forward. The challenge has been is that whether it's parochialism, whether it is my university versus the other, or a mix of federal dollars that incur mandates upon those universities, alumni association gifts, knowing what the true budget is, who's paying for what, can be very blurred to the state legislature when only about 20%, roughly, as I understand it, of the dollars that a university will spend actually comes from the state legislature. So there's a mix of things that a total university system budget with a board of regents appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, making them accountable to you as the citizens of the state of Texas with public responsibility, but a mix of varying funding mechanisms that provide a blurred picture of what the real cost is and the best efficiency that the state can gain. So I'm very pleased to join you here, Dr. Lindsay, to have this great discussion on how we can bring about some market reforms and get the pricing and the economic picture of what the cost of higher ed is under control so that students and parents can make the best decisions for their student based upon their economic situation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Commissioner Paredes?
Thank you. I thought I'd begin by providing the audience some data that's specific to Texas that I think put some of the comments that Dr. Lindsay made in context. Here in Texas, between 2003, the fall of 2003, and the fall of 2013, the last year for which we have complete data, tuition fees in Texas went up 104%. Total tuition itself, excluding fees, went up 110%. And the percent increase in average college course fees went up 66%. Now, with all these dramatic increases, once again, it's important to put what's happening in Texas in context. The average cost of tuition and fees in Texas at a Texas public university is now $7,986 compared to the national average of $9,139. And if you look at community colleges, you'll be immediately struck by the fact that community colleges in Texas have done a remarkable job, relatively speaking, in holding down costs. The cost of attending a community college in Texas is $2,594, in terms of tuition and fees as compared to the national cost of $3,347. And that's a considerable difference. Now, costs occur in context. And probably the most important factor in considering what the context is state support for public higher education in Texas. In the period between 2003 and 2013, state appropriations on a student FTE basis, in other words, full-time equivalent student, declined about 2.1% from $5,996 to $5,873. So state support for public higher education in Texas is declined on a per student basis, but not nearly at the same speed at which costs have gone up. Here's some more information. There's been a lot of talk in Texas about the need for more Tier 1 universities, more top research universities. If we want to do that, we have to look at relative costs. For example, if you look at 2013 state appropriations for student FTE at the University of Texas at Austin, they were funded at a level of $6,184. By comparison, Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley, which is generally considered the best public university in the country, was funded on the level of at $8,044 per student FTE. So we're dealing with conflicting goals here. At the same time that we want to hold down costs, we also want to create more Tier 1 or national research universities, which are very expensive to, number one, develop, and extremely expensive to sustain. A couple of other points. Administrative costs have been growing rapidly, not only in Texas but all across the country. We know that, and some of these costs have a lot to do with the way public higher education has changed in this country. For example, the preparation of students that are going into our colleges and universities has declined. So universities are spending more time on academic support. They're spending more time on developmental education. They're spending more time on remediation. Those kinds of activities require specific skills. So you need a director of developmental education, staff, administration goes up in terms of cost and numbers. Federal regulations. For example, federal contracting has increased enormously in cost. And so now every major university in the country has an Office of Contracts and Grants with sometimes dozens of people working in those offices. As appropriations for public higher education have declined, the need to do fundraising has gone up. So one of the biggest areas of expansion over the past 15, 20 years has been fundraising offices, offices of development. When I started at UCLA 35 years ago as an assistant professor, more than 35 years ago, as an assistant professor of English, there was not an office of development at UCLA. And now there are well over 100 people involved in development at UCLA. I think you'll see similar numbers at UT Austin, Texas A&M, and some of the other larger institutions. The cost of technology has increased dramatically. We're being asked to do more online education, which ultimately should result in some cost savings, but startup costs are enormous. And we have technology offices of instructional technology that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. We have, there's been a cost as higher education has changed in terms of increasing faculty specialization. Increasing faculty specialization has led to a proliferation of courses. Proliferation of courses cost a lot more money than having a relatively small, limited curriculum. The number of majors has increased exponentially in higher education over the past 30, 40 years. We did a cost efficiency, the Higher Education Coordinating Board did a cost efficiency study in the year 2000 at the executive order of the governor. And we found lots of ways that we could save an awful lot of money that don't necessarily deal with administration, although we looked at the administrative costs and determining ways that we could contain some of those costs. But apart from administrative costs, we can save an awful lot of money if we fix some very key problems in higher education. In Texas, the average university graduate accumulates 141 hours of credit to earn a 120-hour degree. Now that's good news because 3 years ago it was 147 hours. For every 2 or 3 hours that we decrease the number accumulated, we could save millions of dollars. In our community colleges, the average number of hours accumulated to achieve an associate's degree that typically requires around 60 hours in Texas is over 90. We can save a lot of money if we create incentives for universities to graduate their students more quickly. If we went to a typical course load of 30 hours a year, not necessarily 15 hours a semester. If students want to do 12 and 12 because they have a part-time job, then let them do 6 in the summer. We've got all the online courses in the world that they can take to do it that way. But there are enormous opportunities for saving, not only in administration, but in terms of student behavior, student preparation, faculty responsibilities. We know that about 80% of lower division students in our universities focus on about 50 or 60 courses. At the lower division, we offer hundreds. Maybe we should pare some of those numbers down. One final point. The McKinsey consulting firm did a study about 7 or 8 years ago about cost inefficiencies in higher education. And I thought it was an excellent study, and they determined that the cost inefficiency that is built into American higher education, both public and private, was in the range of between 15 and 30%, which is to say that between 50 and 30% of all the funding that goes to higher education is used inefficiently. I would argue, and this is not an apology for Texas higher education, but it's a characterization. I still think we have a lot of work to do. We're close to the 15%. The University of Texas has made some extraordinary cost savings over the past 7 or 8 years. Texas A&M has done some extraordinary things, saved tens of millions of dollars, for example, by outsourcing a number of activities. The Texas state system is one of the most efficient higher education systems in the country. There's a lot that we're doing well, and there are a lot of things we're getting better at. We still have a long way to go, but in the context of higher education nationally, Texas is not nearly as inefficient or as costly as a lot of other states.
Thank you, Commissioner Paredes. Dr. Vedder?
I'll talk about administrative bloat, I think, just for the hell of it. America's prosperity, ultimately derives from rising labor productivity. It's cheaper now. Today, productivity of American workers on average is twice as what it was at the time of our bicentennial in 1976. That makes things more affordable. TV sets are cheaper now, relatively speaking. Loaves of bread, airplane trips, blue jeans. But college education is an exception. It takes far more hours of work to pay the tuition today at the University of Texas or at A&M than it did in 1976, despite these schools' vast endowments that no one has mentioned, by the way. There are many reasons for this. which we can't go into here. But the immediate problem is that productivity has not risen in higher education. Indeed, it has almost certainly fallen. Well, all the costs associated with faculty there are a lot of costs associated with faculty that are there. Those costs have increased, and there's a lot of faculty who are excessively paid for doing too little. And I did a study on this for once that Bill Powers wanted to execute me for, but lacked the powers to do so. So the faculty are not without sin. In fact, I see one or two of them in the audience here checking up on me. But let's talk about administration. I'm using West Virginia PowerPoint here. Sorry, no real PowerPoint. In 1976, it took about 3 professional, non-instructional persons to service every 100 college students in the United States. We would call these persons roughly administrators, deans, associate provosts, diversity coordinators, public relations specialists, and so on. Today, instead of 3, we have 6. It takes twice as many administrators to service any number of students. Now, what's the implication of this? Assume that the UT Austin followed the national trends. They would today have about 1,650 more administrators than they did in 1976, even adjusting for the growth in enrollment. Now let's suppose these 1,650 administrators made on average $80,000 a year. That's $132 million spent more annually on administrators, or $2,500 a student. Put differently, the tuition at Austin could be reduced by nearly 1/4 if the school today was as lean administratively as it was 39 years ago. Or put it in another way, 1/3 of the gap between the actual tuition and the $10,000 degree could be filled by slashing administrative staff back to 1976 levels, adjusting for enrollment growth. I looked at an organizational chart for the University of Texas at Austin. It was fairly complex, 34 boxes for various administrative units, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. I went to look at one of these boxes, something called the College of Liberal Arts, and it had its own organizational chart with 43 boxes. Not only was there a Center for European Studies, but there was a second center for East European Studies. And then there was a third study for Slavic and Eurasian Studies. Why couldn't they have one center for European Studies? And then I opened up another one of the boxes that the commissioner mentioned, the Development Office. He's right. There were 118 employees. I counted them. Now, this is just one UT campus. Don't forget that there are other universities, as Brooke Rollins made it very abundantly clear at lunch. And they all have staff overseeing entire systems, such as A&M, where there are 10 major offices under the chancellor, often with duplicative offices at the level of the individual campuses. And because I'm honored to be with the commissioner today, I spent a good hour Monday counting 205 employees working for him at his office here in Austin. Now, universities, as he says, with some correctness, complain about new regulations, safety and affirmative action rules, so forth, the declining quality of students, which is real. I think there's some truth to this. This explains part of it, but it doesn't explain it all. And I would agree with another thing that the commissioner said. Texas is not some atypical, off-the-wall example. The University of California, where he used to work, in the central office, in the office of the president, has 2,000 employees. Not one of them teaches. 2,000. That's almost as many work for you in the Pentagon, Senator, I bet. I've been understating the problem, because of the salary inflation that's going on as well. It's clear that salaries for at least some of the expanded bureaucracy have been rising not only faster than inflation, but faster than compensation of employees generally, and certainly more than that of the faculty who perform the core academic mission. We know about multi-million-dollar football coaches and even million-dollar university presidents, but we don't realize that this salary escalation goes further down. At my typical state university in Ohio, for example, the chief financial officer in the mid-70s made maybe 25% or 50% more than the typical full professor. Today, he makes triple the average full professor's pay. It's not uncommon for schools to replace retiring CFOs making $250,000 a year with new ones making $500,000 or more. And I suspect that's happening here as well as in other states. So I think two questions arise. One, of course, is why is it happening? And second, what can be done about it? The simple two-word answer to the first question, why is it happening, is perverse incentives. In the competitive for-profit market sector, business managers are rewarded for cutting costs, increasing profits, leading to higher stock prices, bonus payments, etc. In the not-for-profit, government-subsidized university sectors, awards for efficiency are mostly non-existent. And indeed, managers who add staff are given accolades by fellow employees who, strangely enough, often play a role in evaluating their own bosses. When I was a department chair, this is true, I talked my university into giving me an extra faculty member, increasing my staff faculty from 17 to 18. Labor inputs went up, services provided stayed the same, productivity fell. But I was given high marks by my colleagues whose evaluation of me partly determined my salary. I was rewarded for being inefficient. Make no mistake about it, the vast expansion of the federal student financial assistance program has provided the cash to allow all of this to happen. Schools have raised fees to capture federal aid dollars given to students and use the fee money to fund more administrators, higher salaries, and other amenities. My favorite, by the way, is the lazy river at Texas Tech that allows students to contemplate life or sleep while floating on a raft. $8.6 million. Now, the federal solution to the administrative bloat problem requires downsizing or eliminating federal student financial aid. We can't do anything about that here. In Texas, it lies in three I words: information, incentives, and innovation. We have no idea most of the time whether new administrative positions produce positive benefits to the school because we don't measure outcomes very well. For example, suppose we create new administrative positions to help fight high dropout rates. Do we do a systematic cost-benefit analysis of those positions after they're created to see if they should continue? Rarely, if ever. We can reverse perverse incentives in various ways. We, for example, can change funding formulas to reward schools who better contain costs to students. Let the schools charge whatever fees they want, but effectively tax them on big tuition increases by reducing subsidies. Perhaps, and I'm sort of lukewarm on this myself, we can give bonuses to institutions for lowering the ratio of administrative staff to per student. But I'm lukewarm because the schools will lie and cheat and change the definition of administrator. I know. I've been in higher ed for 50 years, and I've been ripping off taxpayers every one of those years. Let me make a comment specifically about Texas, UT, and A&M that Bill Powers and John Sharp will not like, but so be it. And by the way, John Sharp and I are on good terms. He invited me to a football game last year. I wasn't able to go. I'm sorry. Actually, when Johnny Football was still there, back when there was good football at A&M. So yeah, one thing great about having tenure, being retired, and getting the hell out of town a few minutes is I can say anything I want. These schools, especially the high endowment schools, especially UT, have advantages that no other public university in the United States have. They have huge constitutionally protected endowments. Allow them, maybe force them, I don't know, to use those endowments more aggressively to lower student costs, if this is your goal. At UT, if half the endowment income were dedicated to tuition fee reduction, fees could come down about $2,000 a year per student. Or you could maintain the current current fees, but give large need-based scholarships that reach also moderately affluent middle-class families. With huge endowments, these schools should either be the very best American public universities, which I'm afraid they're good, but they're not that, or they should be relatively cheap, which they are not as well. My friend up here is starting to look at me strangely, so I guess my time is up. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vedder. Before we open it up for questions, I want to invite the panelists to respond to any of the points that each has made.
Same order.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. I would concur with much I've heard. What I would want y'all to take from some of the specifics that Commissioner Paredes, Dr. Vedder have said is part of our challenge is we're a state legislature, but much in our state, unfortunately so, there are federal impacts, there are state impacts. For those of you that have ever taken a statistics class, and I'm not talking about quarterback ratings, but when you had to do the quantitative methods for your master's degree, I'd much rather done quarterback ratings, but that's another story. Having to do a null hypothesis and control for all the measures making this one change, there are so many things that impact what we're doing in higher education. Part of what I was thinking through and listening to both Commissioner Paredes and Dr. Vedder is that how much of what these administrators are doing are self-inflicted requirements placed on the state universities by either the legislature, the reporting requirements. What are the boards of regents doing for us? Are the board of regents supervising these universities in a way that says, we'll compensate the president for the efficiencies, we'll compensate, do we give, if the board of regents are going to retain tuition, maybe we should tighten up on the boards of regents to get better quality and production for the authority that we've given them, rather than just, in some ways, are they just a gubernatorial appointment, get to put it on their resume and check the block of whatever the president of that university wants to do. We've got to bring market forces back. The challenge is that the state of Texas can only operate in its scope, but the number of things that impact the cost to our higher education are outside the bounds of simply the state legislature. And so I wanted to thank both Commissioner Paredes and Dr. Vedder for making that clear as well.
I want to say for the record that I was a professor and administrator at a public university for 30 years, and I don't think I repped the people off on any of those days. I also want to say that, yeah, there's administrative bloat, and we have to do something about that. When I became commissioner of higher education, the coordinating board had a staff of about 315. We're down to 230, and that was willful, intentional downsizing. So we've got a little bit more staff than you indicated. I'll just say this. We've been proposed, the coordinating board will, for the 4th session in a row, recommend that we introduce outcomes-based funding for universities. And that simply means funding institutions on the basis of what you want them to achieve that's in the state's best interest. We now have in place outcomes-based funding for community colleges and technical colleges, but we haven't been able to do it for universities thus far. I think that outcomes-based funding would change a lot of the behaviors that we've already discussed as being counter to the interests of the state, both fiscally and in terms of economic development and quality of life. So I hope that we will take another look at this issue and I hope accomplish something this time around for universities. I think, once again, that universities are doing better than they've done previously. I believe very fundamentally that if you want people or institutions to continue to improve, you have to give them credit for what they've done. And I think our universities are more efficient than they were, say, 6 or 7 years ago. I think that funding at adequate levels is absolutely key. I think incentivizing students to finish in a timely fashion is key. I think working with K through 12 to make sure students are prepared and handle a full load and complete a degree in either 2 years at community college or credentialed 2 years at a community college or technical school and 4 years at a university is something we absolutely have to insist upon. But there's a lot we've done, but there's a lot more we need to do.
I am in surprising agreement with nearly everything that the commissioner has said. Not surprising, because I usually have battles with university presidents and administrators. But Texas has been, one area where Texas has lagged has been in the funding formulas. And many states, including my state, boring state of Ohio, have moved to at least partially outcomes-based funding, at least funding based on the number of graduates rather than on the basis of number of students. You reward schools who take students in and then they drop out in 6 months or a year. Well, some of these schools shouldn't exist, in my opinion. Why do you let them? Why don't you put them out of their agony? Why do you draw these people in? Four-year graduation rates of 10%, 15%. Look at the numbers. Go on they exist. Schools in the UT system, and other schools as well. I won't name names. You know who they are. Why do you let them exist? Why don't you put them out of their misery? Why do you accept so many students? He mentioned very perceptively and correctly that we have a lot of kids coming in these days are not qualified for college. Well, A, you ought to be doing something about K through 12, but B, why do you let them in then? Why do you let them into college? If the probability of failure is 70, 80, or 90% of these students, are we doing them a favor? The recent survey, this is national data, the recent Federal Reserve Bank of New York says that 46% of recent college graduates are underemployed, taking jobs that were historically been mainly held by high school graduates. The Roman Rokska new study of theirs, Aspiring Adults Adrift, says that 25% of kids 2 years out of college are still living with their parents. 60% are still getting money from their parents. They can't get good jobs. Maybe we ought to rethink, should everyone go to college? Maybe some of them should go to trade schools. Maybe some of them should get certificates to drive trucks. Go to school for 1 year. Maybe we should revisit some of those issues. Have you thought, instead of giving money to schools, giving money to students? Have you thought about it? We had a press conference out here. Laffer was out here promoting something he's going to be talking about later today, which I think I favor, namely giving more aid directly to students to go where they want to school. Why don't we do the same thing at the college level? What's so different about whether you're 19 years old or 16-year-old? Why don't we treat them the same? Maybe we give universities more responsive to student needs if the students are king, if they're sovereign, if they have the money, they control it. Maybe we would get better results. That's moving closer to a market-based system, and that's what we ought to be doing. The main problem is there are no markets in higher ed, no efficient markets in higher ed. And so the incentive systems are all wrong. Under the current way, change has to come from the outside. It cannot come from the inside. It comes in the inside. It does come as the schools move into terminal state. As they go into hospice care, they start to get religion, and we are starting to get some schools that are moving into hospice care. And, I mean, we really are. This is an awful thing to say, but it's true. The historically black colleges and universities in the United States are mostly in very, very bad shape financially. very, very bad shape financially. And so they're now having to start to think, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. And I think the same thing is happening to many of the other schools, particularly those with high amounts of disadvantaged populations. And I think we have to rethink, are we doing the right thing by these people? And I'm starting to think that maybe we are. So that's a few words to think about, a few things to think about.
Thank you, Dr. Vedder. A couple of points here before we turn to questions from the audience. As I think all three of our panelists have made very clear for us, tuition hyperinflation, the student loan debt crisis, administrative bloat, these aren't simply Texas problems. These are national problems. And in some respects, Texas, as we heard, does better, or perhaps we should say is not as bad as the national average is. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that this is a national issue. This is not simply looking at complaining about Texas public higher education. Quite the contrary, it's an effort to save public higher education, first in Texas and then across the country, because as we know, what happens in Texas gets noticed around the country. And when I say save higher education, you may be familiar with a number of studies, first one dating from 2012 by Bain and Sterling, that found that 1/3 of American colleges today are in financially unsustainable positions through over-borrowing, over-diversifying, over-expanding. They have now put themselves in a position where this study and other studies predict they could be going bankrupt in 10, 20 years. We don't want to see that happen. We want to help them, and we think that the way to help them, as with helping in any other enterprise, is by increasing productivity and decreasing costs. Second, and Commissioner Paredes was good to point this out to us. Oftentimes we will hear all sides today agree that tuition is too high, that student loan debt is too high, but sometimes you'll hear, well, that's because of declining state funding of higher education. We had to increase tuition. And using the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board's numbers, which are wonderful and for which I'm grateful, from the period 2000 to 2010, looking at inflation-adjusted per pupil, on an inflation-adjusted per pupil basis, in fact, state funding for Texas public higher education did decrease 17.9%. But during that same period, again, using inflation-adjusted per pupil numbers, university tuition and fees collected increased 76%. So the truth is more nuanced about what caused what. The truth is that there has been a mild decrease in state funding that has been accompanied by a wild increase in university tuition and fees. Now, Commissioner Paredes and Rich Vedder discussed the causes for the increase in administration, and clearly some of this is just simply put on universities, local, state, federal mandates. But the Goldwater Institute did a good study of this in 2010, and what they found is that the majority of the increases in administration have been discretionary. And that suggests that this may be an area where reasonable cost cutting could be effective. As far as outcomes-based funding, again, who can be against funding any organization based on outcomes? I think everyone supports that, and the work that the Texas legislature has done in the last couple of sessions, I think, is wonderful. In fact, 19 states to date across the country have now introduced some sort of outcome-based funding formula. The one thing that we need to be careful of is this. Graduation rates and completion rates form primarily the sole criteria by which outcome-based funding in the 19 states across the union is currently based. And understandably, students graduate faster, spend less money, less student debt, that's all good. But we have to bear this in mind. Forbes did a survey of employers in 2012 and asked them about these sorts of initiatives, and they said they were all in favor of it, but they worried that simply increasing graduation and completion rates might lead to a dilution of academic quality. Now, we know from Academically Adrift in 2011 that across the country, not just Texas, across the country, 36% of students, after 4 years invested in college, show little to no increase in fundamental academic skills: critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills. Now, if tomorrow a report came out that said that General Motors is producing cars, 36% of which are defective, and General Motors responded to the study by saying, we're going to build even more of these cars and faster, right? So, yes, outcomes-based funding, graduation rates, important, but there's got to be a quality control measure that goes along with it, right? For which I have suggested over the last 3 years that the Collegiate Learning Assessment or some comparable instrument measure what students actually get from college after 4 years in college. It could be done for about $35 a student, right, which is less than they spend at a Saturday football game, I'm sure.
But it adds to the fees.
It does add to the fees. It does. I bet, but I have seen fees for football stadiums just fly through at much higher expense. So
No, I'm not disagreeing, Dr.
I know,
Lindsay,
I know,
because
I know.
I carried that bill last time.
I know you
You're
did.
trying to- But you're right, that you're trying to bring some sort of, I'm sorry, you're trying to bring some sort of marketable measure. For those of you that may not be familiar with the CLA, please excuse my intrusion.
No.
But the CLA is the Collegiate Learning Assessment. It's a test that measures general skill. It's not specific to a degree program, but specific to, you're a freshman coming in. Let's test what your education level is across those critical thinking skills as you enter. When you exit and graduate, in that 4 years that you spend in school, take the test again, here's what you measure. That basically allows parents, future students, to say, if I go to X university and I enter at this level, pay X amount of dollars, I will exit at this level on average. That amount of learning, I can measure the cost per unit in learning and my improvement. If you're entering and exiting that 4-year university at the same level and paying X amount of dollars for it, you can make an assessment that I'm not garnering anything for my dollar, my tuition dollar. But it's a market-based, UT Texas does this voluntarily on a random basis. And they've had some good success with it. How do we do it with other universities, expand it to larger populations, and then in some way put it on the college's dashboard that says, if you come to X university and you pay X cost, you'll leave, having entered at point A, you'll exit at point Z in education. That's a market-based type of thing that we're still working on.
Yes. Well, and I want to thank you for the work that you have done on this, with the Collegiate Learning Assessment. And you're right, the University of Texas system needs to be commended. They pioneered the use of the Collegiate Learning Assessment to measure how much students actually learn in their 4 years of college. They've been doing this since 2003. Last year, 200 universities across the country adopted the Collegiate Learning Assessment. So again, this is not simply a Texas problem, this is a national problem. But I think that by virtue of Texas's place in the country, we have an opportunity here in coming up with Texas solutions to provide a model for the rest of the country. Commissioner?
I wanted to respond to your comment, the claim that is often made that if you impose outcomes-based funding on institutions of higher education, all they will do is game the system by lowering standards and lowering expectations, and you get more graduates, but you get much lower quality, and that's what a lot of employers are concerned about. The reason I don't think that would happen in Texas is because we have the best data collection system in the country. The only state that's comparable is Florida. We have data, we can measure performance in individual courses. We have data on GPA, we have data on admission standards. And if the coordinating board saw any remarkable spikes in completion rates, we would collegially go visit the institution and say, You've made these extraordinary gains. We'd like to see how you're doing it so we can replicate this statewide. And if it turns out that they were gaming the system rather than actually significantly improving student learning and outcomes, we'd make a correction. But we are very much aware of that concern, and I don't think it would be an issue in Texas.
Thank you, Commissioner, and that's encouraging to hear. And you're absolutely right, and this is one more bit of good news amid all the problems that we're discussing. Texas is known around the country as having one of the best, if not the best, systems of accountability and transparency in public higher education. I think a good deal of that goes back to the 2003 executive order.
Right.
Good. Questions from the audience?
Thank you. My name is Meg Wilson. I teach technology commercialization at UT. It's not a typical program because it's self-funding. It's an executive master's program. But I have a broader question for you first. You're talking about education and you're not differentiating between undergraduate and graduate. I'd like to get a sense of the different scale and scope for the issues that you're talking about, and are they the same? Because if we use UT as an example, it's an institution that doesn't have a lot of control over its freshman class. It's huge. Part of their goal is to get rid of a number of them before they get to their sophomore year. And so the undergraduate enterprise is not the same as the graduate enterprise. So I'm assuming that they have different administrative structures and other things, and I know some of the different structures. Some of the administrative structures are more designed for the graduate level. So could we tease those apart? Because I think that's an important part of the policy process, and the legislature does deal with those separately in some senses in terms of what the university is doing, the research enterprise, and all those other things.
I'll let our panelists, any of them that wants to talk about that, do so. I can simply say our focus has been on undergraduate public higher education, and the reason, well, you know, the old story about Willie Sutton, the infamous bank robber, and when he was finally caught, a reporter asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. And that's why we look primarily at undergraduate higher education with regard to tax burden. But I'll let any of the panelists here address
Tom,
this.
let me start. I think the Commissioner, I suspect we think similarly on this because he already alluded to this. One thing is not often realized is there's enormous cost differentials within higher education between different kinds of education. Ph.D. programs are extremely expensive. Freshman, sophomore learning instruction in some schools is relatively inexpensive, large lecture classes and so forth. It varies, of course, from institution to institution. Medical schools is another huge area of expense. And I keep hearing about Texas wants to move to having more top-tier universities. You have Texas and A&M, and I know the people from Texas Tech are pining to get on that list. The people from the University of Houston are trying to get member of the AAU. I mean, that's what they live for, is to be a member of the AAU. It's sort of the academic equivalent of going to heaven. But I want to ask why. It's extremely expensive. It's prestigious, yes. But wouldn't it be better to have the University of Texas be better than the University of California overall and have one really super top university, or even recognized as being better than the University of Virginia, which you're not, or better than the University of Michigan, which you're not? You're 3 times the size of Michigan. You're a growing state, they're a declining state. Why shouldn't you be number 1? And so I'm not sure adding to that number is good. I did a study on Oklahoma. Can I use Oklahoma? Don't we all hate Oklahoma and Texas? I did a study on Oklahoma recently. The University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, what are they, 60, 70 miles apart? They both want to be great in the area of finance. So they both have PhD programs in finance. They both have at least 5 professors making $300,000 a year or more. These programs are 60 miles apart. You know how many Oklahomans were in these PhD programs? 3 at both schools. They're all foreigners. They're all foreign students. Now, why in the hell is the state of Oklahoma, admittedly somewhat cognitively challenged state, why in the hell are they allowing this to happen? Maybe the same thing is going on here.
And they were teaching finance?
Well, we have to we have to regulate, and I mean self-regulate the expansion of graduate programs. The job market for PhDs in most fields is saturated. We're producing too many nationally. PhD programs are enormously expensive. It takes too long to complete a doctoral degree these days. The average is 7.5, 8 years now. The whole idea of more elite research universities in Texas is wonderful in concept. It's enormously expensive, and elite research universities are a mixed blessing. Usually one of the ways they become elite is they raise their admission standards far beyond what public universities should do, so that faculty don't have to teach very much.
May I add one thing to that, Commissioner, if I may, just because we want to make sure that we're pursuing research universities for the right reason. I'll be brutally honest with you. My thought is that if we're simply pursuing that to get the federal dollars that NRUF brings down, that stands for National Research University Fund, if the tail is wagging the dog, let's go do this to the cost of Texas taxpayers to go get X amount of federal dollars, we ought to say no. Because then you as the remember, the customer of our public universities is first the taxpayer, then the student, and the person receiving the education commodity. It is not the university. And that is what we've got to fundamentally, culturally change within our higher education system.
I think we would all agree on that.
Hear, hear.
Okay. My name is Steve Pejovich, Texas A&M, retired. I have one comment and 2 questions. My comment is, some years ago, Rich Vedder was my colleague. At that time, he was a very respected scholar. And I have to say today that he is one of the very few people, or very few faculty scholars, one of the very few scholars whose productivity has increased much faster than income. I'm sure you agree. But my comments are, my questions are one for you, Mr. Lindsay, and one for Rich. First for Rich. We talk about, you mentioned, other people here mentioned, we read about it all the time, the tuition has increased way in excess of the rate of inflation. My question to you, Rich, is, could you remind me of economic reason that says that the price of a product should not increase by more than the rate of inflation? The question for Mr. Lindsay is about 10,000 degree. You see, good marketing man would call it $9,999 degree. Would work better. Mm-hmm. But other than that, on what evidence would you argue that the graduates of $10,000 degrees are going to be competitive with the graduates from other universities? Mm-hmm. You know, a few years back, in the 1970s, we wanted to produce, and we did produce a $3,000 car called Yugo. And it was supposed to compete with General Motors and Ford. You know the outcome. Mm-hmm. How can you make sure the $10,000 degree would not have the same outcome?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pejovich. Excellent questions. You know, with regard to... Pardon? With regard to the marketability of a degree that's awarded for $10,000 or less. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is now being recognizing that you can't limit it to a particular dollar amount. That's why it's now called the Affordable Baccalaureate Program. Let me just give you the example of the first real affordable baccalaureate, much of the credit for which goes to THECB and to Commissioner Paredes working with Texas A&M Commerce and South Texas College. What they are doing through using online learning and competency-based criteria, they're addressing a student audience that currently has a very hard time getting into traditional higher education. See, we're accustomed, we think going to college, we think four-year residential institution where the student goes full-time. But in fact, today that applies to only about 20% of college students. Today, the new majority that is seeking some sort of post-secondary education, be it 2-year, 4-year, or some sort of certificate, are non-traditional students, meaning they are over 25 and or working full-time and or with families of their own to support, right? So for them, the affordable baccalaureate may be the only way to the American dream of advancing through education. Now, the degree that they offer, and to their credit, this is a targeted, applied sort of degree in organizational leadership. It's accredited by SACS, the same body that accredits UT Austin and most of the schools here in the South and the Southwest. So it's not clear to me that based on all that employers would come to discriminate against those who received affordable baccalaureates, because what the employer is going to see is a transcript and a degree, in this case, in organizational leadership. And as far as, and we've heard this, and understandably, that when the notion of a $10,000 degree was first put out there, the answer was, well, first they said it was impossible. And then when schools started to do it in Texas, they said, well, you get what you pay for. Well, the public, as I cited that Pew survey, right? 75% of prospective students don't think you get what you pay for. And that's why after the governor issued this bully pulpit challenge, didn't have the force of law in 2011, not only did you see such programs starting to sprout up in Texas, but you have the governor of Florida telling his institutions to do the same thing. I've been contacted by legislators in Oklahoma and in Oregon asking about this. A California assemblyman introduced the bill last year. So I think the argument that you get what you pay for today, a vast majority of the college-going public doesn't agree with it.
Picking up on what you said, and it also relates to Dr. Payevich's question. By the way, Dr. Payevich is a very distinguished scholar and one of the great leaders in the area of understanding the importance of property rights and the role that property rights plays in allocating resources efficiently, and is world-renowned. Recently received an honorary degree from the University of Belgrade, for example. Enough of that. We've been praising each other, Steve. He asked me a question about pricing and so forth, but it relates to what Tom says as well. First of all, you need to relate tuition fees as a price to the quality of the product being produced, and that is seldom done because we have no way of measuring with any degree of certitude what has happened to academic quality over time. So that's point number one. A bushel of corn is a bushel of corn is a bushel of corn. Or Gertrude Stein, what did she talk about? A rose is a rose is a rose. Yeah, you're an English professor. You would know this. So they teach important things in English. That's why most of them are working at Wendy's these days. But anyway, just funny. Let's have some fun while we're here. No, in 1970 or 1960 or 1970, bachelor degree holders made on average 40–50% more than high school graduates. By 2000, it was 80 or 90% more. One reason that colleges have been able to raise their fees a lot, historically, is that it continued to be a good investment in spite of the fact the fees were rising so fast, because the earnings gains from going to college was growing. However, since 2005, you look at the data, those gains are no longer growing. Indeed, they're smaller today in absolute real dollar terms than they were in 2005. And I think we're starting, and that you're getting more and more kids graduating from college who are working at Wendy's, and not just English majors. So the question is, I think colleges may be ready for a big breakup, a big crack-up. There may be this notion that we're going to expand and expand and expand and build billions of dollars in new buildings. I think maybe the height of folly. And I think when an online education coming in as another component of the thing, we need to start thinking more prudently and a little more strategically about the future, and not assume that the past will continue in the future.
I have a question for Senator Birdwell. It's very, very easy to be critical of the University of Texas. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. But my school, University of Michigan, is just as bad. Just as bad, believe me. I last week was on the University of California, Berkeley campus. And I agree with the commissioner, it's maybe the best public school in the country, but it's also bad. Now, my question is this: it's almost an understood cartel, self-protective entity. And even if you agree that Wallace Hull was the most contentious man on the face of the earth, had a terrible bedside manner, when he did what he did, virtually everybody who went to the University of Texas ganged up on him. They just did. The lobby there was intense, but they also ganged up on the legislature. There was an enormous influence on the Transparency Committee. And my question is, with your intentions being noble, will the legislature, in the face of intense lobbying by UT or A&M or whomever, will the legislature have the courage to do a damn thing?
To do what was before the word damn? I didn't hear it.
Well, no, I mean, will the lobbying, do you want to have everybody from the University of Texas against you as a legislator?
Well, the Apostle Paul said, I have fought the good fight. There ain't nothing wrong with a good fight. Okay? I cannot speak for the entire legislature, but I know this. The reason I said what I did a few moments ago about the taxpayer is the first customer of our higher education system, followed by the students in that system. The universities are not the customer. TSTC is headquartered, the TSTC system is headquartered in Waco, that's in the district. It's not my university. It is not my duty to go make TSTC the best it can be because I possess TSTC, not at all. My duty is to the people of Texas to make sure that there are university systems, our 7 systems out there, that can provide the biggest bang for the least buck because our taxpayers demand it. Because we take dollars from people that will never step on that university campus and give them to that university and say, go forth and achieve. I think what Commissioner Paredes and Dr. Vedder have said about the perverse incentives, we're working on, I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation isn't per se accomplishment, it is activity, it is an accomplishment, but we're moving in that direction. I think you will see, not only with what the challenge that Governor Perry gave us in 2011, but with the new leadership that you'll see in the governor's mansion, in the Senate chamber, and the shakeup that's occurring within the entire legislative branch. If not the fight, we may not win it, but the fight will be had.
Could you be cloned?
Well, Look, remember, I do my best to be a statesman. I appreciate your compliment. I was elected to a position of authority not over the people of Senate District 22, but subordinate to the people of Senate District 22. And so it is that purpose that the 80-yard Hail Mary bomb or the walk-off grand slam is sexy. You very rarely see those winning the game. What you see winning is the walk, the stolen base, the sacrifice fly, the 3 yards in a cloud of dust, and a 15-minute consuming drive. Will we get to the end state we want to be at in one fell swoop in one legislative session? No. But we have the opportunity before us to start changing the culture and make the university systems, be it through the boards of regents or us tightening up on the boards of regents, to say, here's what we expect. We need to reward accomplishment, not activity.